I stared out the car window as we arrived at the low-slung cabin. Constructed of dark, weathered wood, it looked aged, fitting seamlessly into the surrounding forest. Eleanor, my wife, switched off the engine and grinned. "We're here. What do you think?" I nodded, taking in the scene. The cabin nestled among tall pines, their boughs heavy with recent snowfall. A stone path stretched from the gravel driveway to the front entrance. We stepped out and began unloading bags of groceries, ski gear, and as much firewood as we could carry. I noticed the deep red of the front door, adorned with a small, hand-carved plaque reading, "Welcome to the Getaway." Inside, the cabin was cozy and inviting. Framed photographs decorated the walls alongside a couple of mounted deer heads. The small living room was dominated by a stone fireplace with a heavy wooden mantel. A comfortable, well-used couch and 2 recliners sat before the fireplace. A low coffee table laden with magazines and board games in the center. The kitchen, just beyond a half wall, boasted a standard refrigerator, gas stove, and microwave, with speckled gray granite countertops and wooden cabinets packed with mismatched dishes and cooking utensils. Eleanor began putting away the groceries, stowing cans, fresh vegetables, and other perishables. I knelt before the fireplace, stuffing crumpled newspaper and small twigs into the grate. I added a couple of logs, struck a match, and set the newspaper alight. The flames caught quickly, warming the room with their familiar presence. Dusting my hands, I felt a small sense of relief as Eleanor glanced over from the kitchen and met my gaze. For this moment, with the fire crackling and the cabin sheltering us from the outside chill, all felt right. "Arthur, it looks like a snowstorm's coming," Eleanor called from the kitchen, still looking at her phone. "According to the forecast, do you think we need to worry?" I tossed another log onto the already blazing fire, filling the room with the scent of burning pine. "We'll be okay," I said, rubbing splinters from my hands. "We've got plenty of canned goods, water, and firewood to last us a week, haven't we?" Eleanor walked into the living room, phone still in hand, her face now serious. "So it looks like the storm will intensify and last several days. Wind speeds are forecasted to be quite high," she said. We exchanged a concerned glance, quickly dismissing our worries. There was no reason to let it dampen our spirits. This was the trip we'd been looking forward to. "Well, let's not let it ruin our day. Want to check out some of the nearby skiing trails?" I offered. Eleanor nodded, looking more cheerful. "Sure, let's enjoy the outdoors while we still can." We layered up in thermals, tied our boots, grabbed our skis and poles, and stepped outside into the brisk winter air. It was a shock, but a refreshing one. We headed directly to the skiing trails, a short walk from the cabin. The snow crunched under our boots as we made our way, grateful for the lack of early winter snow. As we glided along the trails, the worries of the last few days began to melt away. The snowy silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of our skis. I noted the snow-laden branches of the towering evergreens, their winter nests visible among the boughs. The sky above was a bright, clear blue, but it darkened to a heavy gray as we continued skiing. By the time we returned to the cabin, the wind had picked up, the trees swaying and creaking. The first few flakes of the approaching storm began to fall as we reached the door, just in time, Eleanor said, closing and locking the cabin door as the first gusts of the expected snowstorm hit. "Man, it's really starting," Eleanor commented as we stepped inside. She removed her coat, hanging it on a wooden peg near the door, then slipped off her snow-encrusted boots, placing them on the drying mat. "Yeah, I agree," I said, turning to look out the window. The snow was falling in large flakes now. A blizzard wouldn't be long in coming. The ground was quickly turning white, and the pines around the clearing were losing their definition as the snow accumulated on their boughs. "Let's just stay inside the rest of the day," I proposed. Our plans were ruined. We just have to find indoor activities. For dinner, we decided on a team effort, whipping up some pasta with canned sauce. The smell was comforting, making the kitchen feel homey. After dinner, we turned to board games. Eleanor chose Monopoly. We spread it out on the coffee table in front of the fire, the flames dancing merrily behind our makeshift battleground. Eleanor claimed victory, but it kept our moods light. All in all, it was a pleasant evening, but a constant undercurrent of urgency hung in the air, exacerbated by the relentless snowfall outside. The wind whistled through the cracks in the cabin, almost feeling like the storm was beating down on us. We tended the fire one last time before heading to bed, adding more logs to ensure the cabin stayed warm throughout the night. When morning arrived, I knew, without looking outside, that the storm raged on. The usual morning light was muted, and I could hear the winds moan more acutely. I went to the pantry to assess our stores. It was worse than I'd feared. We had a couple of cans of soup, some instant noodles, and a few granola bars. Turning to Eleanor, I said, "We need to ration our food," trying to keep my voice steady. She set aside her book and looked at me, her brow furrowing. "How bad is it?" I paused, leaning against the kitchen counter, surveying our meager supplies. "Well, we've got enough food for maybe 3 days if we ration it carefully. And that doesn't account for our firewood supply, which is also limited." Eleanor shook her head, worry etched on her features. "We're already low on food and almost out of fuel to keep warm. What if the storm doesn't let up soon?" I sat beside her, taking her hands in mine. "Yes, that's our only option. We can't risk going out in the storm. We could easily get lost or worse." We spent the rest of the day conserving. At lunchtime, we each had a small portion of the can of soup, stretching it as far as possible. We also kept the fire to a minimum, just enough to stave off freezing. I only added small pieces of wood, reserving the larger logs for the night to counteract the temperature drop. We both added extra clothing. Eleanor put on a second sweater and wrapped a blanket around herself, while I pulled on a thermal shirt under my regular one. We also put on heavy socks to keep our feet warm. As the day wore on, it became clear the storm wasn't letting up. The wind howled constantly, shaking the cabin's windows and creating unsettling noises as it passed through the surrounding trees. We each checked the fire a few times, acutely aware of the value of each piece of firewood. When night came, we made a small dinner of instant noodles, using less water than usual to conserve fuel. Neither of us felt much like talking. The reality of our situation had settled in. We turned in early to conserve energy, lying next to each other under several blankets. Our stomachs grumbled more than either of us would have preferred. But there wasn't much we could do about it. The storm continued its fury against the world outside our cabin all night, the wind howling and moaning in a constant assault. We did our best to sleep through it, knowing we'd need every bit of our strength in the days to come. I awoke to the sound of scratching, like something clawing at wood. I turned to Eleanor, who lay beside me, eyes open, staring at the ceiling in trepidation. "Do you hear that?" she asked quietly, pulling the blankets tighter around her. "Yeah, I do," I answered quietly. "That's not the wind." We waited a few long minutes, hoping the sound would diminish, but it didn't. Knowing it wouldn't resolve itself, I threw my legs over the side of the bed and began getting dressed, adding a thick jacket over my shirt and pulling on my heavy boots. "I'm going to investigate," I said, meeting her gaze as I tied my last boot. "Be careful," she replied, her brow furrowed with concern, her hands unconsciously fisted, a sign of her agitation. I made my way to the front door, hesitating before gripping the handle and pulling it inward. The sudden rush of icy air made me flinch as it swept into the cabin, accompanied by a few errant snowflakes that danced in the porch lamplight and settled on our tattered doormat. I stepped out into the snow, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. My stomach dropped. Someone had carved the words, "Leave now," into the wooden door, the grooves deep and messy, as if done in a fit of rage or panic. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, stepping out of the cabin, bundled in her scarf. I could see the curiosity and worry in her eyes. I nodded, pointing with my gloved finger at the message. "Someone, or something, wants to make it very clear they don't want us here." She looked over the crude letters, her posture tensing. "Must be some sort of prank," I said, more doubtful than believing. "Local kids, maybe." "You heard the scratching just like I did. It didn't sound like local kids to you, did it?" Eleanor hesitated, chewing her lower lip. Finally, she nodded. "You're right. It was sinister, not playful. We can't just wait around for something to happen," I said, my tone edging towards urgency. "We're not going back out into the storm. We're going to run out of food and firewood soon, anyway. We need to take action." Eleanor met my gaze, steeling herself. "All right. What's the plan?" "First, we're going to do a quick sweep around the outside of the cabin and see if we can find any information or clues about who or what wrote that message." We didn't waste any time, quickly adding our sweaters and jackets over our thermal layers and putting on our insulated snow boots. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and found a particularly thick, heavy branch near the fireplace as an impromptu club. Eleanor retrieved her phone from its charger, planning to use the camera to document anything we found. Eleanor and I stepped outside, closing the front door behind us and immediately feeling the cold air bite at us. The sound of our footsteps in the snow as we began to walk around the cabin was very loud. I turned on the flashlight, cutting a bright path through the heavy darkness and casting long shadows. Then we saw them. Footprints starting at the edge of the tree line, circling the cabin, and returning back into the forest. They were large, with long toes. Unlike any human or animal prints either of us had ever seen. The snow around them was still disturbed and fresh, and my heart began to pound as I realized just how deep in trouble we were. "We need to be careful," Eleanor said, gripping my arm with surprisingly strong hands. "These prints aren't anything like the ones we made or any we saw yesterday. There's something else out here. Something unknown." I nodded. Something definitely was out here, and it didn't seem interested in being friendly. We shared a glance, both understanding that our peaceful retreat had taken a sharp turn. Now it was about finding out what was in these woods, and frankly, surviving it. We continued deeper into the woods, following the footprints and keeping my flashlight ahead of us. The trees were tall and thick-trunked, their bare limbs stretching skyward, weighed down by the growing blanket of snow. The underbrush was covered in a deep layer of snow that crunched with every step, and the air was mostly silent except for the occasional creaking of branches under the weight of the snow. About 15 minutes later, something caught our eyes. We turned to each other, nodding towards the same direction. Dangled over a low-hanging branch was a piece of torn and faded fabric, looking suspiciously like a portion of a coat or maybe a backpack. I aimed the flashlight at it, contrasting the brightly lit material against the dark expanse of the forest behind it. "What do you think?" I asked Eleanor, who had joined me. She pulled out her phone and took a couple of pictures, adjusting the focus. "I don't know. It's creepy. I mean, who would be out here in this kind of weather? It's so remote and isolated. And why would they leave a message for us?" More confused than anything, we agreed it was best to get back to the cabin. The atmosphere had changed as we made our way back, becoming more claustrophobic and oppressive. I felt a chill creep up my spine, an uncomfortable prickling feeling like we weren't alone. I picked up my pace, and Eleanor kept pace with me. At last, the cabin appeared, its familiar outline a welcome sight amidst the shadowy trees. We hurried up the steps, and I fumbled with the lock, throwing the door open as soon as I could. I slammed it shut and locked it again immediately, and we both took a long, deep breath. The relief of being back inside was quickly overshadowed by the unsettling knowledge that we weren't alone. Someone or something didn't want us here. "We need to take shifts sleeping and keeping watch tonight," I said, the necessity of it hanging heavily in the air. Eleanor nodded once, her face drawn but determined. "Yeah, we can't afford to let our guard down now." The comfort and relaxation we'd experienced since our arrival were long gone, replaced by a growing sense of confinement, as if the walls were closing in on us. The tense silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the wood and the howl of the wind outside, both somehow more ominous now. We found ourselves situated at opposite ends of the sofa, each lost in our own thoughts, both understanding that our once peaceful winter retreat had become a sort of prison. The fire had become little more than a dying source of heat. We hesitated to add another log, considering how much colder it would get without it. The flames flickered and danced, growing lower and fainter as the coals struggled against the chill. Our dialogue had dwindled to the bare minimum: when to change out for the night watch, or if we heard something outside. There was an unspoken awareness, like an elephant in the room, that the situation was growing more precarious, but none of us were willing to say it. What were they? Why were they here? How did we get out of this? I found myself glancing at the window more than a few times, each time with a growing sense of dread, expecting to see someone or something looking in. Each time, though, there was only blackness and the incessant falling snow, showing no signs of letting up. The outside world was an empty void, a chaotic dance of snowflakes and shadows, as if the very earth had decided to ally against us, to keep us sequestered and defenseless. Hours ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last in this cramped little space. The tension in my muscles and the knot in my stomach grew more pronounced with every passing hour. The reality of our situation became more acute, an inescapable fact we could no longer overlook or pretend wasn't there. When morning came, it found me in the dim gray light filtering through the curtains. The fire had long since died, leaving only embers and ash in the grate, and the chill had returned to my bones. I checked the clock. Just after 7:30 a.m. Eleanor stirred, snuggling deeper into her blanket, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Anything come of your shift?" I asked, rubbing my arms against the chill. "Nope. Just the typical sounds of the forest and wind. Nothing else," I answered. But we both understood that typical wasn't quite the same anymore. The first order of business was to take stock of our provisions. We had a handful of soup cans, some crackers, and a bag of rice. Not a lot, No way to tell how long we'd be trapped. We need to ration this, Eleanor stated, setting one can aside for today's meal. I agreed, then remembered the firewood. We were running low. Only a few logs remained stacked in the corner, good for another day, maybe two if we were careful. We had a quick, sparse breakfast before sitting down to discuss things. The message carved into the door and the torn fabric we'd found in the woods weighed heavily on our minds. There was no way we could continue to write it off as an oddity of nature or even a prank. "We need a plan," Eleanor said. "Yes, we do," I replied. "We need to figure out what's going on. I think our best bet is to stay here, especially with the storm. But we need to gather more information," I said. "We'll explore a little deeper into the woods today. See if we can find anything that tells us who or what is responsible for this." Eleanor nodded, and we readied ourselves for another trek into the forest. Eleanor and I prepared ourselves for the morning chill, which had grown sharper. I could see my breath in the foggy air and zipped my jacket all the way to my chin. Eleanor readjusted her gloves for a better grip on the flashlight as she clicked it on, the sudden brightness revealing our surroundings. "Let's go," I said, gripping the large stick I'd selected as a weapon. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing," I muttered. "It'll have to do," she replied, her eyes meeting mine. I could hear the determination mixed with unease in her voice. We shared a look before pushing open the cabin door. The hinges protested louder than they should have in the stillness of the early morning. The door swung open, and a gust of crisp, cold air hit me, reminding me how glad I was for my heavy jacket. We stepped out into the open, away from the comfort of the cabin, and the door slammed shut behind us with a loud thud, sealing our fate and sending us out into the wilderness. The silence of the forest greeted us. The blackened trunks of the trees were bare of leaves and blanketed in a thin layer of snow, along with their outstretched limbs. The dim morning light barely reached us through the thick canopy above. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that seemed to hang in the air, like a warning from the woods themselves. When we started moving, the snow was surprisingly soft and cold beneath my feet. My boots sank into it with each step, and the sound of my footfalls seemed deafening in the quiet of the forest. We took our time, acutely aware that the sound could draw attention. Eleanor led the way, shining her light back and forth. A few times, the moving beam caused us to jump. A gnarled root that looked like an outstretched hand, the glint of a small animal's eyes watching us pass. But so far, nothing that set my heart racing. It felt both a short distance and a long one at the same time. With each footfall, I felt the sense of our predicament growing heavier, the forest closing in around us, our movements growing more purposeful. Still, there was an unspoken agreement among us that we needed to continue forward, that there was no reason to turn back now. My senses were heightened as we continued our trek through the snow, my eyes constantly scanning the darkness around us. At last, after what seemed like a long while, Eleanor's light fell upon the first of the ominous warnings. "Stay away," crudely but intentionally carved into the bark of a tree. "Well, we're not alone," I said, a little louder than I'd liked. My eyes were already wandering the edge of the woods, looking for any sign of movement, anything out of the ordinary. Eleanor had dug her fingers into my arm. I could feel her grip tightening as we stood there. "Do you think it's a person or something else?" she asked, her tone a mix of inquisitiveness and underlying fear. Both of us were on edge, more than we were a few minutes ago. "I don't know, and I'm not really interested in finding out," I said. The thought of encountering whoever or whatever was responsible for these ominous messages was the last thing I wanted. Eleanor nodded, and we moved on. It wasn't long before we came across another one, this one even more succinct. Just the word "leave" carved into the side of a tree. "This is getting more and more unsettling," Eleanor said, eyeing me nervously. "Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing," I replied, swallowing hard. "Let's just finish checking our perimeter, and then we can head back and reassess," I said, trying to sound more cautious than indecisive, my words a fragile facade of logic over the increasing fear that had begun to take hold of us both. Eleanor nodded, and with one last lingering look at the grim messages, we turned and resumed our unsettling patrol. I think we were both conscious of the fact that we were running out of time and choices. But for the moment, we just focused on ensuring what we could see around the cabin was clear. Eleanor and I were just about back to the cabin when she suddenly halted and pointed ahead. "Look," she said, her tone anxious. I followed the line of her finger and saw another mound of snow, this one circled by the trunk of a large tree. My pulse quickened, and I took a few cautious steps closer, using the stick I'd been carrying to carefully brush away the snow from its surface. When I uncovered the red of aluminum cans, my heart dropped. I cleared away more of the snow, and when I reached the end of the icy pile, I saw that the cans were empty and had been brutally punctured. Dread washed over me, amplifying the already precarious situation into something more urgent. "Yeah, we need to come up with another plan, and quick," Eleanor said. She was right. Panic was starting to tickle the back of my brain, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep it at bay. I think, for a moment, we could try to make it to the road. It's probably 2 miles through this forest to get there. But if we can reach it, we might be able to signal a car or locate the nearest home, I said, more to myself than her. They might have a landline. Eleanor looked at me. "It's a risk, but we don't have a lot of other options, do we?" I couldn't argue with that. I'm on edge, but we need to stick together. Panicking now won't do us any good. "First light tomorrow, we start gathering anything we can take with us and get moving," Eleanor said. "It's going to be a long hike, so we need to use every bit of daylight we can." "Yeah, I'm with you," I said. In my head, I was already making a list of what we needed to grab. Water bottles, a couple of blankets for warmth, the first aid kit, just in case. "Let's go back and get things ready. We leave at first light." We made our way back through the silent forest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The faint sounds around us, the whisper of a branch moving in the wind, the distant snap of compacted snow beneath our feet, seemed to conspire against us, like the forest was warning us somehow. But we'd made our decision. We were getting out of here. Still, the walk back to the cabin was fraught with tension. I knew we were both acutely aware that the rest of this night was going to drag on interminably, filled with startlement and uncertainties. As soon as we were back in the cabin, I closed and locked the door, though it felt more like a gesture than any real protection. The cabin walls felt like they were closing in on us, transforming from a refuge to a prison that we needed to break out of as quickly as we could. Eleanor's eyes were restless as she surveyed the room, passing quickly over the primitive furniture, drab curtains, and threadbare rug, as if she were looking for a way out or some sort of secret. She suddenly froze, her gaze lingering on a strange deformity in the floorboard in front of the hearth. Without a word, she dropped to her knees and used her pocket knife to pry the board up, revealing a shallow space beneath it. Her hand disappeared into the darkness, and she retrieved a small bundle of newspapers, old and yellowed, and tied with a fraying string. I could see her hands tremble slightly as she undid the tie and began to flip through the musty pages, her eyes widening in alarm. "Here, you need to read this," she said insistently, folding one of the papers and handing it to me. I took it from her and began to read. The newspapers were from several decades ago, but the stories immediately captured my interest. It was about a creature that had supposedly been stalking these woods since they were first settled. According to the article, there were several anecdotes from local residents about their experiences. Livestock disappearing from their pens, strange and unrecognizable footprints in the mud, and unsettling noises, howls and roars, coming from deep within the forest at night. The author also noted that, remarkably, nobody had ever been able to photograph the beast or trap it, despite numerous attempts. The article concluded with a dire warning. "If you're going to hike these woods, be ready for anything." I swallowed hard as the implication of what we might be facing sank in, tightening the knot of anxiousness in my gut. "We may not be dealing with a man," Eleanor said. Her words hung between us, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Or maybe it was just the ice water that had replaced my blood, giving me that impression. As I was mulling over her statement, an ear-splitting roar erupted from outside, tearing through the cabin's atmosphere. It blasted through the walls like they were made of cardboard, echoing through the very air, and filling me with the feeling of unavoidable doom. I couldn't place this roar. It didn't sound like a man or any animal I knew. It was something alien, something unholy. Another chill ran down my spine, setting my teeth on edge and enhancing the discomfort that had settled in my gut since we first found those carved messages in the trees. Eleanor and I stared at each other, both of us seeing the same worry mirrored in the other's eyes. "We can't stay here," I stated. I knew that venturing outside might be just as dangerous, but sitting here and waiting for whatever was out there to come upon us felt like a death sentence. "We need to think this through," Eleanor said, rubbing her hands on her jeans. "If there's really something out there, or even if it's just some lunatic, we need to have a plan." I nodded. "Right. Let's take stock of what we have. I don't care how small or insignificant it may seem. It could all be useful." We spread out everything we could think of that might help. The first aid kit, the water bottles, some rope, a couple of pocket knives, and the flashlight. It wasn't a lot, but it was all we had. "We wait until first light and then head for the road," Eleanor suggested. "It's a couple of miles through the woods, but if we stick to the compass and keep our speed up, we should be okay." "What if we see it?" I asked, all too aware of the unspoken question between us. "Then we'll have to fight it," she said. "Because we can't just stay here and wait to die." We were both quieted by another sound that made our blood run cold. The sound of footsteps moving through the snow outside. It seemed to move around the cabin, like whatever was out there was stalking us, sizing us up before it attacked. We both froze, not even willing to breathe. I waited a long time before the sound of footsteps faded away into the natural silence of the forest. When it did, my sense of relief was short-lived. The rest of the night dragged on, one of restless watchfulness. We flinched at every sound, from the howling wind in the trees to the settling creaks of the cabin as it sat on its foundation. Sleep eluded us, coming only in minute catnaps, and even then our eyes never fully closed. I was already awake and snapped my eyes open at the first light of dawn filtering through the cabin windows. Eleanor stirred next to me, sensing the change in ambient light in the room. We shared a quick look, eyes mirroring the unspoken resolve we both felt. "Time to rise and shine," I grumbled. Eleanor nodded, and we both stood, knowing that any delay in our departure could be detrimental. I grabbed the backpacks we'd loaded the previous night, which contained water bottles, a couple of blankets, and the first aid kit. Eleanor checked the flashlight to ensure it was functional and handed it to me. "Did you take the knife?" she asked, fixing her gaze on me. "Yep," I replied, holding up the small, unimpressive blade we'd found in the kitchen drawer. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Eleanor tightened her jacket zipper to her chin and repositioned her gloves, ensuring no bare skin was exposed. It was cold enough that we needed to be careful about that anyway. But neither of us was really worried about the temperature too much. It was more about what we were going to face out there. "I think we should do one last check of everything before we head out," I suggested. And we took a quick inventory of the backpacks again. Rations, water, medical supplies, blankets, and the knife. "Looks like we're as prepared as we can be," Eleanor said, and I could hear the underlying tremor in her voice, just as I felt it in mine. My hand shook on the cold metal doorknob as I prepared to turn it and push the door open. But then the wind and snow just sort of stopped. The sudden absence of sound was as jarring as the threatening noises we'd been hearing all night. Taking a deep breath, we stepped out onto the creaking porch and into the eerily quiet outside world. My eyes quickly adjusted to the low light, and within moments, I saw two glowing spots in the distance, framed by the dark mass of the trees. Those weren't lights, though. They were the thing's eyes. It was tall, easily 7 feet or more, and barely even visible in the darkness. The fur of its powerful body almost camouflaged it into the tree line. But it was the eyes that were the most disturbing. They raged with an unnatural light, and somehow they seemed to glow from within, piercing the darkness and exploring our very being. "Is it letting us go?" Eleanor whispered, her voice hardly a murmur in the stillness. "I don't know. But let's not stick around to find out," I answered, keeping my voice low and tense as I never broke my gaze from the creature's glowing eyes. At last, the clearing appeared, and our car was parked right where we left it. A nondescript sedan that now seemed like the most glorious thing I'd ever seen. "I've never been happier to see a car," Eleanor said. "Me neither," I replied, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the car keys. They were cold, but I'd never been more thankful to have them. We unlocked the car and tossed our packs into the back seat, slamming the door behind us. For the first time in what felt like ages, I was in a space that felt enclosed and protected from the nightmares we'd faced. I turned the key in the ignition, fully expecting the car not to start. But it fired up with a rumble. As we drove away and the cabin and woods faded from view in the rearview mirror, I felt a strong sense of closure. Whatever that was in the forest, whatever we went through, it was behind us now, in every sense of the word. We drove for a few minutes in silence, neither of us willing to broach the subject of what had just happened. But as the miles passed, and the dark trees of the forest gave way to the more recognizable landscapes of civilization, the tension left me, a little more each moment. "We're not going back there," Eleanor said after a long moment. "I agree," I said, easing my grip on the steering wheel. "Never again." And as we joined the highway and put the road that led us to the cursed cabin behind us, I realized that we weren't just leaving a place. We were leaving an experience in our lives. one that we both would remember, but one that we were both happy to move on from and leave in our rearview mirror. That's the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Have you ever experienced something like this? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like and subscribe button for new stories daily. See you in the next story.